pause the screen share. All right. Cool. So we should be good to go now. We're recording and presenting. All right, guys. So we've got the map pulled up again right here, and I like this one just because again shows the territory that we've gained since the annexation of Texas. Here, it's all of those southwestern states, including California. And just as an aside, the influence, guys, of not only Spanish-speaking peoples, but really the mission period in the Catholic Church is still pretty prevalent. Whether you're talking about mission architecture, I mean, I live right down the road from a shopping center in Mill Valley that's all mission-style architecture. I don't even really know why I went down that road. It's not going to be tested on that. I'm just trying to get you to see the connection with that, whether it's place names and roads on the freeway or architecture, what have you. That Spanish or that Hispanic legacy is still very prevalent. So that could potentially be added in there, but I don't really. Anyhow. All right, we did all of those already. We have the concept down of the doubling of the size of the nation. And so pretty quickly, folks, Congress has got an issue. California's got enough people to become a state almost instantly after gold is discovered. The population is over 60,000, and we remember that is the bottom threshold to become a state. It's 60,000 people. And so California's got that number. And so their decision to become a state and apply for admission to the union is really going to throw Congress into a serious crisis here. California is going to propose a constitution that disallows slavery. They're going to be a free state, and that's going to again be bad news for the southern states, guys. California is an incredibly populous state. They're going to wield a lot of electoral power, not only in terms of their ability to elect the president. They'll have a lot of congressional power. It's pretty obvious it's going to be a populous state. Having it be free is not something Southerners are excited about. So its admission is going to start a serious crisis, and that'll be solved by the Compromise of 1850. And hopefully you guys can remember some of that. As I'm scrolling through this, I actually see something that I forgot to mention before the war is even over, guys. And crap, I wish I would have mentioned this before I started talking about the Compromise of 1850, but that's okay. Just hit pause for a second. It's important you understand, guys, that Northerners, especially the Transcendentalist writers, but not just Transcendentalists like Emerson and Thoreau, many Northern congressmen are against the Mexican-American War because they see it as a war to expand slavery. And that's evident in the Wilmot Proviso. This is just simply a vocab term, but you really need to know it because if you're writing an essay on the sectional crisis, you need to prove that your claim, is accurate. And your claim is probably going to be that the addition of new lands will heavily divide the nation. That's the easiest claim in the world to defend, guys. As we add new territory to the nation, it's going to further divide us. An example that will prove that statement is accurate can be seen in the Wilmot Proviso. That's a congressman from a northern state. I actually forget what state he's from. And Wilmot proposes that all of the land we're about to acquire from Mexico be off limits to slavery. Southerners don't take that, as a gesture of kindness. Let's say that, folks. They really view it as an assault on their way of life. Remember that sectional line, the 3630 line, all that land we're about to get from Mexico is below that line, folks. All of this land could potentially be slave states. And think about this from the Southern perspective. Southerners fought and died in the Mexican-American War. Southern tax dollars went to support the military during that war. It's public land. If I'm a Southerner, I'm not really going to accept you saying it's off limits to slavery, myself anyways. Not only is it below that 3630 compromise line, Southern dollars and Southern blood have helped acquire this land. You can't really tell me that I can't bring my property into it. Remember, slavery is recognized as property under the Constitution right now, or slaves are. So if I'm a Southerner, it makes perfect sense why they would not like David Wilmot and see that this is really a threat to them. There's all sorts of gnarly political cartoons about the Wilmot Proviso. I don't have them ready queued up, so I don't need to look at them. But just be aware if you're writing about the sectional crisis, guys. I probably went into too much detail on this, but your claim is going to be that it divides the nation. The acquisition of new territory divides the nation. Wilmot Proviso is just an example that statement is true. Division seen in Congress. So anyhow, I stumbled my words a little bit with the explanation, but I think you guys get it. So what are we going to do with all this land that we just took from Mexico and enter the Compromise of 1850? Now, guys, there's all sorts of backstory to the Compromise that you don't have to know. You're simply going to be expected to understand a couple provisions of the Compromise. And the first and most important provision is California is going to be admitted to the Union as a free state. Now we got to give the Southerners something. We've given the Northerners and the Free State people, a lot. We got to give the Southerners something, and we're going to create this new fugitive slave law. This is where you can, in a northern state, you could be essentially deputized by the sheriff and forced to participate in like a slave roundup posse. There's going to be slave catchers entering northern states and essentially kidnapping free blacks. There's lots of different records and sources of people who've never been slaves essentially being identified as a slave catcher. The slave catcher might say, this is my property, or I have a warrant to bring this person home. And, I don't really know how you become free necessarily. I don't know if a free man living in Pennsylvania has like papers to prove he's free. I know that might sound kind of dumb of me, but I don't know how you prove you're free if you're a free black man in a northern state. I don't know. But we have absolute proof that, many freemen are kidnapped and brought back to southern states under this Fugitive Slave Act. It's a pretty offensive law, guys. Think about it for a moment. Slavery is illegal in a state like Massachusetts, but yet you're telling me that my local sheriff, if he wants, can force me and deputize me to participate in like a slave roundup posse. That's going to really upset Northerners. That's what Harriet Beecher Stowe's novel Uncle Tom's Cabin is all about. It's a critique of the fugitive slave law. When we did this quiz, way back last semester, folks, one of your sources was a Ralph Waldo Emerson source, and he's critiquing the fugitive slave law, essentially saying that I thought I had the quote ready to go in my head, and then it just slipped off the edge, and I don't know what happened to it, but. Please be aware, folks, that there's going to be a lot of Americans that take personal offense to the fugitive slave law. Being forced to return someone to slavery is going to be very unpalatable to many of them. Another component of the Compromise of 1850, guys, will be popular sovereignty, and you have to understand what that means. Remember, slavery is a very, very hotly contested issue, and even a lot of congressmen are even having trouble coming to some conclusion on it that seems fair and equitable. It seems to be kind of a stalemate in Congress. So their decision is, let's let the people in these territories decide it. And it's not going to be a big deal in Utah. Not a lot of people live in Utah or Nevada for that matter, or New Mexico. But when they do popular sovereignty in a couple of years in Kansas and Nebraska, that's when we have that serious conflict known as Bleeding Kansas, where we have settlers rushing in, trying to essentially outpopulate the other side to influence the election, whether or not the state will be free or not. Not really turning violent in the middle of the desert out west, but in the Great Plains, when they extend popular sovereignty there, it's going to be a problem. You've got to know what that phrase means, popular sovereignty. The voters will decide. The other component of this is, guys, that I want you to know, well, actually, just focus on those three. The other two are relatively minor. There's a border dispute with Texas that'll be addressed. It's not really important for this test. And understanding that they're going to ban the trading of slaves in D.C., Washington, D.C., but not slavery itself. I don't quite understand that. It seems kind of ridiculous to me. It's not an important concept because it doesn't really fit with an argument about the sectional crisis. It's a good tidbit, but there's a million good tidbits of information. That's one that I just would encourage you guys to drop. If we can only absorb so much information, drop those last two. Remember those first three. Free State California, newer and tougher fugitive slave law, and it opens up the concept of popular sovereignty in New Mexico and Utah. Not yet in Kansas. That's going to come a little bit later with the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Any questions so far, guys? You have to know Compromise of 1850. A really common essay prompt I would see might be something like, analyze how the United States government implemented compromises to avoid conflict between free states and slave states, or something like that. And they would expect you guys to not just only talk about the addition of new territory, they would expect you to talk about the Compromise of 1850, the Missouri Compromise of 1820. They might expect you to talk about the Northwest Ordinance. Remember, that was 1789, or the Articles of Confederation. First time that the federal government's ever restricted slavery in a territory. You have to understand different actions the federal government has taken. You don't have to be experts in them, guys, but if you're asked, ways the federal government has tried to address the issue, you need a couple examples. And there's three right there: Northwest Ordinance, Missouri Compromise, Compromise of 1850. I'm not an expert in any of that stuff. We just simply know that our federal government is going to take action on this stuff, and here are ways in which they took action. Cool. Yeah, a little map action for you, for those geographically challenged. Thanks for hanging with me, guys. We'll just go for about 10 more minutes today. I know I'm spitting a lot of information at you, but I think it's a very, very good chance that you could have a DBQ on the sectional crisis. It's just such a good topic, and it spans, roughly from the Second Great Awakening in the 1820s all the way to the Civil War. Here are a couple posters that I showed you guys in class when we did this lecture originally. These are Fugitive Slave Act or Fugitive Slave related posters, but these are actually warning people in northern states to look out. I'll read this one for you guys. Caution, colored people of Boston. You are hereby respectfully cautioned and advised to avoid conversing with watchmen and police officers of Boston. For since the recent order of the mayor and aldermen, they are empowered to act as kidnappers and slave catchers, and they have already been actually employed in kidnapping, catching, and keeping slaves. Therefore, if you value your liberty and the welfare of fugitives among you, shun them in every possible manner, and so many hounds on the track of the most unfortunate of your race. Keep a sharp lookout for kidnappers and have top eye open. That's literally telling the free black people of Boston, guys, to not converse with the police officers, not to essentially trust people because they've been authorized to act as, in the words of this poster, as slave catchers. Understand the perspectives. And this is where Harriet Beecher Stowe will write arguably the best-selling novel for, you know, something like 40 or 50 years. I don't know when it'll be passed on some bestseller list, but that's Uncle Tom's Cabin, guys. And you don't have to know the plot of the novel or anything like that, but you have to know it's a very, very, how should I say this? That she's using the argument of moral suasion. Remember we talked about that, folks? She's trying to appeal to your moral side. She's not really essentially arguing that we need to live side by side with free black people in an equitable society. She's just trying to get you to morally agree that owning another human being is wrong. And what she does is she tells the story of Uncle Tom and essentially a runaway slave. I've never even read more than the Wikipedia page on the book. I don't know what the whole book is about, but it's about a runaway slave escaping over the Ohio River to freedom, folks. This book will sell millions of copies, and that's 1850s copies. It will be made up into like a Broadway performance. Remember, I don't know the literacy rate of Americans in the 1850s, guys. It's high, but they're still definitely illiterate people. Stage performances of this novel will be made up, and they'll be very, very popular. This book, folks, if you haven't read this book in the 1850s, you've at least heard of it. You could probably even know that it's about a runaway slave. Again, folks, even though Americans in the 1840s and 1850s, they know slavery exists, they're not reading tons of slave narratives yet. This is yet another example where Americans are like, oh man, this is what slavery is? You mean they like separate the families and sometimes the women are sexually assaulted? I didn't know. Novels like this are really, really critical like that. Frederick Douglass's slave narrative plays that same level of importance, folks. It evokes emotional responses from readers, and it is really, really significant in causing a larger portion of Americans to, again, not be for equality, guys, but be against slavery, for abolition. And remember, they're demanding immediate abolition at this point, immediate abolition without compensation. Imagine if you're a Southerner, how you think about that. Know the Northern perspective, know the Southern perspective. You're telling me that you're going to free my property, which is constitutionally protected, and not even pay me for it? Know the Southerners' perspective as well. Cool. We know Uncle Tom's Cabin, guys. We're just going to do one or two more vocab terms. Oh, man. There's so much more left in this chapter. That's okay. We'll finish it up tomorrow. We've already been going for 20 minutes almost. All right, guys, next piece of legislation. And if you get remember, guys, if you get a sectional crisis DBQ, you don't have to remember every single example. You just have got to make an intelligent claim and back it up with a few examples. You could write this essay without any single one piece of this vocabulary, I would say. So anyhow, here's my next one, folks, and it's Kansas, Nebraska. This is where popular sovereignty will turn out to be a really, really, really bad idea. Now, the background of this, folks, is the Transcontinental Railroad. If you want to build a railroad through the Great Plains, we need to survey that territory first. We need to actually organize it into a federal territory that's been surveyed and has military posts. So that is the context for creating both the territory of Nebraska. And again, guys, Nebraska at this time, it's all the Dakotas. It's like part of Wisconsin. It's a huge, gigantic territory. They're trying to organize that into federal jurisdictions so they can build a railroad across it. But as they're simultaneously doing that, folks, they are going to pass the issue of slavery onto the settlers within the territory, folks. Now, it's not going to be an issue in Nebraska because remember, Nebraska it's primarily going to be settled by people migrating from northern states, folks. No one really thinks the area in northern Nebraska territory is going to turn to slavery. But Kansas is a separate issue. Kansas borders Missouri, which is a total slavery stronghold. So there's a very real fear on the part of abolitionists that people from Missouri are going to flood into the newly created territory of Kansas and influence the Constitutional Convention, So Kansas will be a slave state. This is where you have what are called the free soilers, folks. People are moving from all over northern states, guys. You'll have clergy and churches raising money to send families to literally migrate to Kansas to try to influence whether or not slavery will become the law of the land in there. People are flooding into Kansas, and it's going to result in violence, folks. This is an issue, guys, that Congress even can't really agree on. And that's really, arguably some of the most highly educated men in the nation. Doesn't mean they're the smartest, but folks, this is a major issue. This is where that congressman gets up. What's his name? Preston Brooks, and he beats Sumner, on the head with his cane. Sumner's trapped in his writing desk, guys. Can you imagine that today? I mean, I know liberals and Republicans kind of like dislike each other in Congress, but I can't imagine there actually being a physical altercation. This dude takes out a cane and beats this dude over the head with it, strikes him. I have the image up right there that you can see, and it's widely reported, folks. This is the issue that they're going to now allow the settlers in Kansas to decide. And this is where Bleeding Kansas comes, folks. This is a miniature, historians kind of call this a prelude to the Civil War, a little miniature Civil War here, folks. Atrocities committed on both sides. You have John Brown, the evangelical abolitionist, hacking up pro-slavery men. You have all sorts of reprisals on both sides, folks. You don't have to understand really the details about, Bleeding Kansas in terms of how many people died, how long did it last for, but you have to understand when the issue of popular sovereignty is thrown to the territory, it results in violence. If I'm arguing, guys, that the addition of new land in the United States is going to further divide us, how could you find a better example than Bleeding Kansas? How could you find a better example than the Compromise of 1850? Anyhow, know what this is. In Ken Burns' The West, there's all sorts of good clips on this. You could find them on YouTube. You just type in Bleeding Kansas into YouTube, folks, and you will find all sorts of good clips. Do you have to know who John Brown is? No, but you should, guys. John Brown is a great example that shows the division that the nation is currently facing here. He is going to not only participate in Bleeding Kansas, he's most famous for his failed slave revolt at Harper's Ferry. It's the same kind of strategy behind every slave revolt, folks. We're going to start at a plantation. We're going to, murder the slave owners, free the slaves. We're going to move down the road to the next one, and it's going to snowball from there. John Brown attempts to take a federal armory at Harper's Ferry, West Virginia. It's not that far from Washington, D.C., and it's essentially a total failure, folks. His slave revolt doesn't grow. It's something like 40 men, and they end up just getting surrounded, shot up, captured. This will absolutely scare the hell out of the South, folks. The South is going to start organizing militias after this. A lot of historians I've heard, especially in the Ken Burns Civil War, oh, shocking, another Ken Burns reference, they're going to really say that John Brown is kind of the spark, or like not the lightning rod, I'm just going to say the spark. I forget the term they use, guys, because he is going to once again, get Southerners really convinced that abolitionists are evil people that are going to agitate these blacks to murder us in our bed. And that's a very real fear that slave owners have. And remember, not every Southerner owns slaves, but even Northerners, guys, they don't look on John Brown, oftentimes with a lot of reverence. Some Northerners do, for sure, but not all of them do. He's taking this situation and murdering people. And regardless if you think slavery is okay or not, you should probably ask yourself, is there any moral issue or any political issue to where like violence is justified? I don't approve of slavery, but I don't know that I would murder a slave owner. I don't actually know how I would feel in the 1860s, but I just think that's an interesting question to ponder for you weirdos who like to ponder stuff. A couple images of John Brown, guys. This is one depicting him as really a fanatic. This is a very famous oil painting, really fanatical John Brown, standing in between the two sides of the Civil War. And then the next one, guys, is actually really important because it's showing John Brown incredibly sympathetic. He's on the way to the gallows. He's not depicted as some fanatic. He's depicted as kind of a weathered, grizzled, gray old man. People are kind of looking upon him not with disdain or like he's crazy. He's kissing the little black baby on the head right there. Remember, guys, he's going to become like a martyr for radical abolitionists. Not all Americans. A lot of Americans are going to see him as this crazy fanatic. But again, for radical abolitionists, he's going to be a martyr for the cause, who's willing to kind of fight fire with fire and ultimately sacrifice his life for the abolition cause. All of this, guys, is in the context of defending the claim that the addition of new territory is going to further divide the United States. I'm sure you could come up with a couple different theses that are legitimate for the sectional crisis, but I just think that's the easiest one to defend. There's just ample evidence that we can do to support it. All right, last vocab term, This is one of the 15 must-know Supreme Court cases, folks, and it is the Dred Scott v. Sanford. You don't have to know the details of the case necessarily. It's a little complex, but here's with just the basics. I'll try and give it to you in 30 seconds. Dred Scott, the slave, is owned by a gentleman in the Army. On this gentleman's military assignment or his commission, he is required to move to free territory, I believe Wisconsin. So he takes his slave to free territory. Now remember, guys, territory is not a state. He brings Dred Scott to free territory. When they return back home, Dred Scott essentially is able to sue for his freedom. It makes its way through a couple different courts, and Dred Scott's lawyer will ultimately argue to the Supreme Court that since his owner voluntarily took him into free territory where they resided for an extended period of time, I think it was 1.5 years, that Dred Scott is by definition free. Now, guys, there are obviously a couple more nuances to the case, but that's not important. What you have to understand is the judge's ruling. The judge's first part of the ruling is that Dred Scott, as a black man, is not a citizen and therefore can't even sue anyone in court. That's part one. He could have dropped it right there. And this is Andrew Jackson's Chief Justice, Roger Taney. Remember, Jackson's not the president anymore. Jackson's been gone for a while. But Roger Taney, the Jacksonian Democrat's now the Chief Justice. So his first part of ruling, guys, and he could have stopped here. He said Dred Scott doesn't even have standing to sue in court because he's not a citizen of the United States as a black man. The second part of the ruling, guys, goes even further. And he essentially says that slave owners may bring their property, which means their slaves, into federal territories that are not yet organized into states. The justice was here say that states are the only things that can ban slavery. The federal government can't ban slavery. A territory is essentially run by the federal government. They cannot ban slavery. Only a state has the sovereignty or whatever you want to, has the authority to decide that issue for itself. So what this means is that 3630 line that's been on the books for a while since the Missouri Compromise of 1820, that line is now shattered. This Supreme Court decision is incredibly important because it, in theory, opens up slavery to any federal territory, regardless of how far north it is. This means you could have slavery in the Dakotas. It means you could potentially have slavery in, Idaho. I don't know exactly when Washington and Oregon are organized into states, but you get the example, folks. This is a really, really crushing ruling for abolitionists and people who are anti-slavery. Owners may bring their may bring their property or their slaves into federal territories that are not yet states. Anyhow, that's kind of the states' rights. You remember how, guys, only the Supreme Court can challenge can determine the constitutionality of a law? Well, this is a states' rights advocate sitting on the bench, giving a huge amount of power to states in this regard and taking it away from the federal government here. By extension, folks, he is saying the federal government had no authority when they made the Northwest Ordinance, and they had no authority when they made the Missouri Compromise. All of those earlier attempts to ban slavery by the federal government in places that weren't yet states, unconstitutional. He's saying that was a constitutional overreach. Now, all those places have been organized into states already, so it effectively doesn't change the status of slavery there, but it's a pretty startling rebuke of the federal government there, folks. If you have questions, I don't know how good my example was or my explanation was, but feel free to ask. Here's the little quote from Taney, and stop me at any moment, guys, but here's the quote from Taney. I'll read it and we'll call it a day. He's talking about African Americans here. They had, for more than a century before, been regarded as beings of an inferior order and altogether unfit to associate with the white race, either in social or political relations, and so far unfit that they had no rights which the white man was bound to respect. And that is part of, and I've never read the entire opinion, I'm sure it's a multi-page document, but that's an excerpt from the Supreme Court's opinion right there, folks. So please understand what the Dred Scott decision means. It's a very controversial Supreme Court case. It'll be essentially strengthened I shouldn't say strengthened further because the Civil War is going to change a lot of crap, obviously, with slavery. But there's going to be another major Supreme Court case in the 1890s, Plessy Ferguson, that's going to essentially sanction segregation. I'm getting way ahead of myself. I'll save Plessy Ferguson for a time when it's a little bit more relevant. It's not necessarily relevant for the sectional crisis. I think I'm gonna stop it there, folks. We already talked about the end of the Mexican-American War. All I wanted to highlight today was the Compromise of 1850. It's essentially, what are we going to do with all the land? That's what I was trying to highlight. We're about to double the size of the nation again. What the heck is going to happen to all that land? Wilmot Proviso, Compromise of 1850, including all that popular sovereignty stuff and fugitive slave law and free California. We talked about Uncle Tom's Cabin, that popular piece of literature. And then we talked about Bleeding Kansas, what happens when we try to extend popular sovereignty to these territories right there. And we talked a little bit about John Brown for the deep details. And we talked Dred Scott, major Supreme Court case. I think I did okay. I stumbled on my explanations a few times, but I think I did it coherently enough to get the points across, folks. Is there anything that you feel like you missed? I mean, you guys have the learning targets in front of you. You've got the vocabulary. Look at it real quick. Is there anything on here that you feel like I didn't do a good enough job explaining, or you want me to try again? Sometimes my words make sense to some of you, but not others. That's totally fine. Sometimes they don't make sense to anyone. Look at these learning targets, folks. Any of these that you are still not sure on? We didn't yet talk about the election of 1860. That's Abraham Lincoln and the Lincoln-Douglas debates. I'll do that tomorrow in a few minutes. Or I should say, tomorrow I will do that over the course of a few minutes. But everything else on there, guys, from Manifest Destiny, whether it's Oregon Trail, annexation of Texas, people moving across the Great Plains like the Mormons, to the Mexican-American War, and everything that goes along with the addition of new territory. Are we good to go on that? All right. Cool. Then I'll go ahead and stop presenting and stop recording.